All right, listen to this. I just went through the most insane experience of my life. A HOA. Karen called the cops on me and tried to fine me $2,000 just for hunting on my own property. 2,000 bucks. But what she didn't know was she picked the wrong person to mess with. I have a job that, well, I'll get to that in a bit. The ending, oh man, it was so sweet. I still laugh when I think about it. This story will have you saying, holy crap, she got what she deserved by the time it's over. Drop me a comment and let me know where you're watching from. This is going to be a wild ride. I should have known something was off when I woke up that Tuesday morning to what felt like the most peaceful day I'd had in months. The October air was crisp, just the way I like it, and I was sitting on my back porch with a glass of fresh orange juice watching a family of deer casually stroll through my yard like they owned the place. My property backs up to a forest preserve, so seeing wildlife isn't unusual, but there was something almost magical about how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet that makes you think, maybe you're going to have one of those perfect days where nothing goes wrong. Looking back, I should have known better. I'm Eric Johnson, by the way, 32 years old, and I've been living in this house for about 3 years now. It's nothing fancy, but it's got 5 acres of land, which is exactly what I wanted when I moved here. Privacy space and the ability to do what I love without bothering anyone. Or so I thought. The house sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by mature oak trees that provide perfect natural cover. I'd specifically chosen this place because it felt like a sanctuary somewhere. I could escape from the chaos of everyday life and just exist in peace. See, hunting season was just starting, and I'd been looking forward to this day for weeks. I'm not talking about some reckless weekend warrior type of hunting either. I take this stuff seriously. I double-checked my rifle, made sure the scope was aligned, and headed into the preserve. I was about an hour into tracking when I spotted a deer near the clearing. The backstop is a massive dirt berm I built myself. Took me the better part of 2 weekends to get it just right, and there's nothing but trees for hundreds of yards beyond that. That's just how I do things. Methodical, careful, responsible. I'd been making this same trip to the preserve every weekend for the past 3 months. Same trail, same routine, same careful preparation. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching my pattern, but apparently being responsible doesn't matter to some people. I was field dressing the deer when I heard this voice screaming through the trees behind me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice was shrill, angry, and getting closer by the second. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She looked like she was ready to charge at me, but I stayed calm, reminding myself it was my property. I wasn't going to back down. She came crashing through the underbrush, her face bright red branches catching in her blonde bob haircut, and she looked like she was about ready to explode. I'd never actually met this neighbor before, though I'd seen her car coming and going at all hours. She always seemed to be in a hurry, always looked stressed about something. But this was our first real interaction, and honestly, it wasn't starting off great. Though now that I think about it, I'd noticed her car parked near the trail entrance a few times before. I just assumed she was another nature lover. The fury in her eyes was something I'd only seen in people who were completely convinced they were in the right, even when they obviously weren't. "Good morning to you too," I called out, trying to keep things civil. I walked over to the fence, genuinely curious about what had set her off so dramatically. "I'm Eric Johnson, your neighbor. I was hunting on the federal preserve with proper permits. Everything's completely legal." I figured maybe she was just startled by the gunshots, and once I explained what was going on, we could clear the air. Maybe even introduce ourselves properly and laugh about the misunderstanding later. But the look on her face told me this wasn't going to be one of those neighborly conversations where we end up becoming friends. This woman was furious, and she wasn't interested in explanations or common courtesy. The way she was looking at me, you'd think I'd just committed murder in my backyard instead of target practice. Something about her demeanor felt off, like she was personally offended by my very existence. "Legal, legal," she screamed, and I swear her voice went up about 3 octaves. "You're endangering every single person in this community. This is a civilized neighborhood, not some backwoods hunting ground." She was practically vibrating with rage at this point, her hands shaking as she pointed at me accusingly, and I have to admit I was a little taken aback. I mean, I get that gunshots can be startling if you're not expecting them, but her reaction seemed way over the top. Like, way over the top. The woman was acting like I'd personally threatened her family. "I'm calling the police and the HOA." She continued, already pulling out her cell phone with the speed of someone who had done this before. "We'll see how legal this is when they drag you away." And with that dramatic declaration, she turned around and marched back toward her house phone, pressed to her ear, already dialing. I stood there for a moment, honestly not sure whether to laugh or be concerned. Was I overreacting by thinking she was being completely unreasonable, or was this just the kind of neighbor I was dealing with? The kind who called the authorities over everything? Something told me this wasn't going to end well. True to her word, within 30 minutes I saw a police car pulling into my driveway. Officer Martinez stepped out, looking tired, like this wasn't his first rodeo with neighborhood disputes, and probably wouldn't be his last. I have to give him credit, though. He was professional about the whole thing from start to finish. I showed him my hunting license, federal permits, and explained the preserve boundaries where I'd been hunting and the backstop barriers I'd built. Martinez nodded his approval as we walked around taking notes and asking reasonable questions about my setup. "Sir, your setup meets all safety requirements," he said, making notes in his little notebook. "Though it might be a good idea to give your neighbors a heads up next time, just as a courtesy." I thought that was fair enough. Maybe I should have mentioned it beforehand, been a better neighbor about the whole thing. But Martinez seemed satisfied that everything was above board, and I watched his car pull away feeling pretty good about how things had been handled. At least the police were reasonable, even if my neighbor wasn't. But as I stood there watching the police car disappear down the street, I wasn't feeling angry about the whole situation. I was feeling intrigued. Something about the way that woman had reacted, the immediate jump to threats and police calls, struck me as off. Rebecca marched off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. It wasn't just the gunshots that had her worked up, it was something else. This woman, whoever she was, had just made a very bold move. She'd called the police on me for doing something completely legal on my own property without even trying to have a reasonable conversation first. And now I was curious about what her next move would be. Was this the end of it, or was she just getting started? Interesting, I said to myself, still staring at her house. I wonder how far you'll push this, Rebecca. As I watched her retreat, I had a sense that this was far from over. Rebecca wasn't just upset about my target practice. She had bigger plans, and somehow I was going to be the target. I don't know if this is a real threat or just a comedy show about to end itself. But something told me I was about to find out, and it was going to be more interesting than I originally thought. A week went by without any drama, and I was starting to think maybe my neighbor had moved on to bothering someone else. Maybe she'd found a new target for her outrage, or maybe the police visit had actually gotten through to her. But then I opened my mailbox and found this thick envelope from the HOA. I'm talking thick like they'd stuffed a small book in there, or maybe someone's entire life story. The return address just said Homeowners Association, printed in official-looking letters, and I figured it was probably some routine notice about community meetings or landscaping updates. You know, the usual HOA stuff that nobody really reads but everyone pretends to care about. When I opened the envelope, my mind couldn't process what I was reading. A $2,000 fine for a perfectly legal activity on my own land. This had to be some kind of joke. Violation notice and fine was printed across the top in bold red letters like they were announcing the end of the world, and underneath that was the amount that made me burst out laughing. $2,000 for violation of community safety regulations and noise ordinances. $2,000 for 3 shots on my own land. I actually had to read it twice because I thought maybe I was seeing things like my brain was playing tricks on me. The notice was signed by someone named Rebecca Gray, who apparently was the HOA president. So now I had a name to go with the angry face from the fence line, and suddenly everything started making a lot more sense. I could practically hear Rebecca's voice in my head. Legal consequences, she'd threatened. She was out to make sure I paid for every step I took on my own land. The document went on to explain that I had violated several community standards by illegal hunting activities on community-adjacent land and creating excessive noise disturbances. It demanded payment within 7 days, or I would face serious legal consequences. The notice cited repeated violations documented over the past 60 days with attached photo evidence. I'm not kidding. This thing read like she was trying to evict me from the neighborhood, maybe the entire state. The whole thing was so over the top that I couldn't help but laugh. I mean, who tries to fine someone $2,000 for target practice? But as I kept reading, something started bothering me about the whole thing. The language was weird. The procedures seemed off, and the more I looked at it, the more it felt like someone was just making stuff up as they went along. Like they'd watched a legal drama on TV and thought they knew how this stuff actually worked. Instead of stewing in anger, I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office, demanding to know how they could justify such an outrageous fine. But when the person on the other end stammered, I knew I had them. The phone rang 3 times before this nervous voice answered. Hello, HOA office? The woman sounded like she was afraid someone was going to yell at her, which honestly made me feel bad for her right off the bat. Hi there, I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. This is Eric Johnson. I received a fine notice that seems a little questionable. Could you tell me which specific regulation I violated? There was this uncomfortable silence on the other end, like she was trying to figure out what to say, or maybe looking around to see if anyone was listening. I just handle paperwork, Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Gray manages all enforcement decisions. She said you have 7 days to pay or face serious consequences. The way she said it made it sound like she was reading from a script or maybe repeating words that had been drilled into her. Something wasn't right here. This woman, Amanda, based on how she'd answered the phone, was clearly being controlled by Rebecca in ways that made her uncomfortable. Consequences. I asked, and I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. This was getting more interesting by the minute. What kind of consequences are we talking about here? But before she could answer, I had another question. And while we're at it, Amanda, what regulation specifically covers firearms use on private property? Another pause. A long one this time. I could practically hear her sweating through the phone. I'll have to check with Mrs. Gray and call you back, she said, and then the line went dead. Just like that. I stared at my phone for a moment, realizing I'd just uncovered something bigger than a simple fine. That evening, I decided to do some research. I pulled up everything I could find about HOA law, community regulations, and enforcement procedures. I spent hours going through legal websites, court cases, and regulatory documents. What I discovered was pretty interesting, and by interesting I mean completely damning for Rebecca. Turns out HOAs can't just impose direct fines like Rebecca had done. There's a whole legal process they have to follow with specific steps and timelines. First, they issue a violation notice, giving you time to fix the problem. Then if you don't comply, they can place a lien on your property or take you to court. But they can't just demand $2,000 and threaten serious consequences if you don't pay. That's not how any of this works. That's not how any of this has ever worked. Rebecca just committed her first illegal act, I said to myself as I printed out the relevant statutes. But as I read closer, I realized she'd been documenting my hunting trips for months. Photos times dates, she'd been building a case. This was getting more interesting by the minute, and I was starting to realize I might be dealing with someone who had no clue what they were actually doing. The more I researched, the more I realized Rebecca was operating completely outside the bounds of legitimate HOA authority. I made a strategic decision right then and there. I wasn't going to pay this ridiculous fine, and I was going to start documenting everything that happened from this point forward. Every interaction, every document, every phone call. I created a digital file on my computer labeled Rebecca Gray Documentation, Day 1, and started scanning in all the paperwork. If Rebecca wanted to play legal games, then we were going to play by real legal rules, not whatever made-up nonsense she was operating under. And something told me she had no idea what she was actually getting herself into. I had a feeling this woman had been getting away with this kind of behavior for a long time, probably because most people just paid the fines rather than fight them. But I'm not most people. I closed my laptop and looked at the stack of HOA regulations I'd printed out. All right, Rebecca, I said to the empty room, if you want legal warfare, let's use real laws. I ended the call, but the unease didn't leave. If Rebecca was willing to send me this fine without explanation, what else was she hiding? I was about to find out, and I wasn't sure I was ready. I wonder if she knows she just challenged the wrong person. Over the next few days, I turned into something of a solo detective. I started requesting every piece of documentation the HOA had, and I mean everything. Meeting minutes, financial reports, violation records, correspondence files, the works. I told Amanda I was considering legal action against the improper fine, so I needed to review all the procedures and precedents to build my case. She seemed nervous about it, stammering through our conversations, but legally she had to provide the documents. I could tell she was uncomfortable with my requests, but she couldn't really refuse them either. When I finally got my hands on everything, what I found was absolutely shocking. I pulled out the HOA's fine print, but what I found didn't add up. The regulations they cited didn't exist in the official records. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a fine, it was about something much bigger. This wasn't just about my hunting fine anymore. This was about a pattern of corruption that went way deeper than I'd imagined, and it had been going on for a long time. The financial reports were the first thing that caught my attention, and they were a complete mess. There were all these expenses listed for community improvements, but when I looked at the addresses, they didn't make sense, like at all. Landscaping improvements for common areas, $3,000, but the address listed was Rebecca's house. Fence repair for community property, $2,000, and again same address. Road maintenance for shared access, $1,500, that apparently benefited Rebecca's driveway access exclusively. I whistled low as I went through page after page of this stuff. She's been using HOA funds as her personal bank account, I said to myself. This woman wasn't just power hungry, she was stealing from her neighbors, and she'd been doing it systematically for what looked like years. The more I dug, the more I found. Pool maintenance that went to her backyard pool, tree removal that happened on her property, even community security improvements that turned out to be her personal security system. But it got worse, way worse. I decided to do a little background research on Rebecca Gray herself, and what I found made my blood run cold. Court records showed she'd been involved in 3 separate harassment lawsuits at her previous residences. 3 different neighborhoods, 3 different sets of neighbors who'd had enough of her behavior and taken her to court. And she'd lost all 3 cases. The final case had resulted in a restraining order being issued against her. Serial neighborhood tyrant, I muttered as I read through the court documents. This is her established pattern. She moves into a neighborhood, takes over the HOA, if there is one, and then terrorizes everyone until they either move away or take legal action. But apparently she'd never faced anyone who was willing to dig this deep into her background. Most people probably just dealt with her behavior or moved away rather than fight. This was bigger than I thought. That's when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered it was Amanda from the HOA office. Except she wasn't calling from the office and her voice was different, scared. "Mr. Johnson," she said, and her voice was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. "I'm calling from my personal phone because I can't stay silent about this anymore. Mrs. Gray has been forcing me to forge meeting minutes, fake board signatures on documents, and create violation notices for people who haven't actually violated anything. I have proof of everything, and I can't be part of it anymore." My heart started racing. This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed, but I also realized Amanda was putting herself at serious risk by coming forward. If Rebecca was as vindictive as she seemed, Amanda could face serious retaliation for exposing her. "Can we meet somewhere private?" she asked. "She has a whole file on you, Eric. Photos of you going to the preserve, your truck at the trailhead, even your hunting schedule. She's been planning this for months." We met at a coffee shop about 20 minutes away from the neighborhood, one of those generic chain places where nobody would recognize us. Amanda looked like she hadn't slept in days, constantly looking over her shoulder like Rebecca might walk in at any moment. Her hands were shaking as she ordered her coffee, and she kept checking her phone like she was expecting threatening messages. She handed me a flash drive that contained everything, and I mean everything. Forged meeting, minutes from meetings that never happened, fabricated board signatures on documents that were never voted on, email threads, showing Rebecca threatening other homeowners with fines and legal action for imaginary violations. And there it was, folder after folder of surveillance photos showing me entering the forest preserve, time-stamped and organized by date. She'd been stalking my hunting routine since day one. "She made me create a whole fake paper trail," Amanda explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. "Every violation notice, every fine, every board decision for the past 2 years has been completely made up. I couldn't just let this go. I knew I had to take the fight to her." But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my property, it was about her control over the neighborhood. I spent the rest of that evening going through everything on the flash drive, and I realized this situation was so much bigger than my hunting fine. Rebecca Gray had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise disguised as HOA management. She'd been embezzling money, forging documents, harassing residents, and creating fake legal authority to back up her threats. And now I had documented proof of all of it. email chains showing her demanding money from residents for violations that didn't exist, forged signatures on documents authorizing expenditures that only benefited her, meeting minutes claiming board approval for decisions that were never actually voted on by anyone. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the mountain of evidence spread across my desk. "Rebecca Gray," I said to the empty room, "you've been running a criminal operation for 2 years, but every criminal makes mistakes, and you just made yours when you messed with me." As I sat there with the research spread out in front of me, a knock echoed through the door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Rebecca had come to make her next move. And this time, it wasn't going to be just a fine. I'm starting to wonder if I'm preparing for a war that's bigger than I originally expected. But one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down now. This woman had been terrorizing an entire neighborhood, and it was time someone put a stop to it. After hours of digging through legal documents, I found what I was looking for, an error in their records that proved Rebecca's actions weren't just overbearing, they were illegal. I had her. I decided to ignore Rebecca's fine completely. Little did I know my silence was even more infuriating because she'd invested months documenting what she thought were violations. All that surveillance work, and I wasn't even acknowledging her case. No payment, no response, no acknowledgement that her ridiculous demand had any validity whatsoever. For someone who was clearly used to people jumping when she barked orders, my silence must have been absolutely infuriating. But days went by with nothing from me, and that's when things started getting really weird. Actually, weird might not be the right word. Disturbing is probably more accurate. Because Rebecca's response to being ignored was to launch what I can only describe as a full-scale stalking campaign against me. The drive-bys weren't new. I realized she'd been doing this for months. But now, they were more frequent, more obvious. She was no longer trying to hide her surveillance. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. She was conducting surveillance and she was getting bolder about it. I'm talking about a dozen times a day, sometimes more. She'd drive past slow down in front of my house, and I could see her craning her neck to see what I was doing. Sometimes she'd stop completely and just sit there in her car watching my house, like she was waiting for me to do something illegal. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I glanced around trying to act normal, but deep down I knew this wasn't going to end well. The woman had clearly lost her mind, and she was escalating her behavior in ways that were frankly frightening. She didn't just stop. She stepped out of the car with a camera in hand and walked closer to my yard. I could hear the clicking of her camera, each snap echoing through the silence. She was preparing evidence for a plan I couldn't even begin to imagine. I'd be doing completely normal stuff, working in my garden, washing my truck, just existing on my own property, and there she'd be standing at the edge of my property line with this huge telephoto lens taking pictures of me like I was some kind of criminal or celebrity. The clicking became such a regular background noise that I started timing my activities around it. But things escalated beyond just photography. After a particularly rainy night, I went out to check on my vegetable garden and found muddy footprints all through my backyard. High heel prints, which was bizarre enough since my yard was pretty rough terrain. But when I followed the trail, I realized someone had been walking all around my property, checking out my hunting equipment, storage, my target practice area, even looking in my garage windows. Rebecca had actually trespassed onto my property in the middle of the night. I couldn't stay passive anymore. I grabbed my phone and started recording her actions. But this time I didn't just record. I called the police, immediately warning them about the harassment. Instead of just gathering evidence, I started making calls, one to a lawyer and another to a former HOA member who'd gotten fed up with Rebecca's tactics. It was time to turn the tables. That's when Rebecca decided to weaponize the city services. Over the next week, I had visits from every inspector you could imagine. Code enforcement showed up because apparently my lawn was dangerously overgrown, according to an anonymous complaint. The inspector took one look at my perfectly maintained yard and just shook his head. Then came the zoning inspector because my truck was supposedly blocking public access, even though it was parked in my own driveway. The business license inspector showed up because someone reported I was conducting illegal business operations from my home. I wasn't running any business at all. Each inspector told me the same thing, that the complaints were obviously bogus, but they had to follow up on everything that came in. Rebecca was systematically harassing me through official channels. As soon as I realized I was being watched, I called Amanda. She didn't just give me information, she sent me all the documents she had been gathering, including emails from the HOA and false accusations Rebecca had made. Amanda was becoming more than just a source of information. She was a crucial ally in this fight. Then Rebecca called the police again. Officer Martinez showed up looking even more tired than the first time. "Mr. Johnson," he said with a sigh, "Mrs. Gray claims you made death threats against her. Mind telling me what that's about? I was pressure washing my driveway when he arrived." "Death threats?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "Officer, I haven't spoken to that woman since the day we first met. Although," I added, gesturing toward the street, "she has been photographing me from her car for about 2 hours today." Martinez looked where I was pointing, and sure enough, there was Rebecca's car parked down the street. What would you do in my situation? Keep taking it or fight back? Because at this point, I was getting pretty fed up with the whole thing. When Martinez left after giving Rebecca a talking to about filing false reports, she actually had the nerve to approach my fence again. But this time, something was different about her demeanor. She seemed smugly confident, like she was holding cards I couldn't see. And when I walked over to meet her at the fence line, I felt my entire presence shift from amused tolerance to something much colder. Each piece of evidence I gathered made it clearer Rebecca had crossed a line. And now I was ready to make her pay. "Rebecca," I said quietly, looking her straight in the eye, "you're digging yourself into a grave, and I guarantee you it's deeper than you imagine." For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw genuine fear flicker across her face. Rebecca looked at me, her gaze filled with contempt. "You think I'm scared of your phone?" she sneered. She took a step back, but then she turned around and said, "I won't let this go, Eric." She walked away, but I knew this game was far from over. The feeling inside me was growing stronger. This wasn't something I could ignore anymore. It was time to take action. Just as I was about to call my lawyer, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Rebecca standing there with a smug smile holding a court summons. It was time for the real fight to begin. As soon as I received the summons, I didn't waste a second. I went straight to the courthouse, ready to file my countersuit. The next morning, I made a phone call to an attorney named William Parker, who specializes in HOA disputes. When I explained everything that had been happening and showed him all the evidence I'd collected, including Amanda's flash drive, his reaction was pretty intense. He spent about 2 hours going through everything, occasionally whistling low or shaking his head in disbelief. When he finally looked up at me, he seemed genuinely stunned. "Eric," he said, shaking his head, "this woman has committed embezzlement, harassment, document forgery, trespassing, and abuse of power. We've gone way beyond civil violations here. This is criminal prosecution territory." And the way he said it made it clear that Rebecca had stepped over lines she probably didn't even know existed. "Meaning what exactly?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Meaning potential prison time," William replied, arranging the documents into neat stacks. "But we need absolutely undeniable evidence, something she can't dispute or explain away in court. Right now we have a strong case, but I want it to be bulletproof." I nodded and leaned back in my chair, already formulating a plan in my head. "I know exactly how to get that kind of evidence," I told him, "but I'm going to need you to be ready to move fast when the time comes." William agreed, and we spent the rest of the meeting planning out the legal strategy. That afternoon, I went shopping for some high-end security equipment. I'm talking about professional-grade cameras, the kind that record in crystal-clear 4K with audio and timestamp everything automatically. I was almost done setting up when I noticed something, a shadow moving near the edge of my property. Rebecca. She was watching me again. It was time to finish this. I spent the rest of the day installing them around my property, making sure they weren't visible, but covered every possible angle of my fence line and entry points. I also set up what I started thinking of as a bait zone near the fence, strategically placing some of my hunting equipment where Rebecca would be sure to notice it if she came snooping around again. If she was determined to trespass on my property looking for evidence, I was going to make sure I got evidence of her trespassing. The woman was predictable in her obsession with controlling me, and I was going to use that against her. Amanda called me late that night, her voice urgent. "Eric, I found something that could take Rebecca down for good." She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was a key player in the fight. 2 days later, Amanda called me with some disturbing news. "Eric," she said in a hushed voice, like she was afraid someone might overhear her, "Mrs. Gray is planning something big. She's been ranting about delivering your final lesson, and she's prepared some kind of lawsuit demanding $10,000 in emotional damages. But there's something else. She keeps talking about months of documented evidences and how she's going to finally end your illegal hunting operation. Eric, she thinks she has an airtight case against you. She paused, and I could hear the fear in her voice, the genuine terror of someone who'd seen Rebecca's true nature up close. She keeps saying she's going to eliminate the problem permanently and that you'll be expelled from the neighborhood through any necessary means. Eric, I think she's planning to do something really dangerous. I thanked Amanda for the warning and hung up, but her words kept echoing in my mind. Eliminate the problem permanently. What exactly was Rebecca planning, and how far was she willing to go? That's when I reached for my wallet and pulled out a piece of identification that I'd been keeping to myself this whole time. As I looked at the federal badge and ID card, I couldn't help but smile grimly. Rebecca, I said to myself, you have absolutely no idea what necessary means really entails, but you're about to find out. I spent the evening double-checking all my camera systems, reviewing the evidence I'd already collected, and making sure everything was legally perfect. Because I wasn't just setting a trap for Rebecca, I was choreographing her complete and total destruction, and I needed every detail to be absolutely flawless. Can you guess what Karen's going to do next? Because based on Amanda's warning, I had a pretty good idea, and it wasn't going to be pretty. I sat on my deck that evening, but instead of my usual relaxed mood, I felt like a predator waiting for prey to make a fatal mistake. The peaceful neighbor phase of this situation was officially over. She thought she was dealing with some regular guy she could intimidate and bully into submission. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Just as I secured the last camera, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Amanda. She's coming tomorrow. Be ready. I don't think she's going to stop. The game was on. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. She's coming tomorrow at dawn. I saw her putting bolt cutters and a hammer in her car. Be ready. I looked at the message and felt that predatory smile spread across my face again. I sat back reviewing all the evidence one last time. It was time to take action. I called my lawyer ready to take Rebecca down for good. 5 in the morning came early, but I was already awake and watching from my kitchen window when Rebecca's car crept into my driveway like she was conducting some kind of covert military operation. She was dressed head to toe in dark clothing, moving in this exaggerated, sneaky way that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. She had bolt cutters in one hand, a hammer in the other, and she was carrying this huge wooden sign under her arm like some kind of deranged protester. The woman looked like she was preparing for suburban warfare. I watched her creep around the side of my house toward my backyard, and I had to give her credit for commitment. Most people would have realized they were crossing a line somewhere between the trespassing and the property destruction, but not Rebecca. She was all in completely committed to whatever insane plan she'd cooked up in her twisted mind. What happened next was captured in perfect 4K high definition, with crystal clear audio and precise timestamps. Rebecca systematically destroyed my fence with those bolt cutters, and she was thorough about it. Every cut was deliberate, methodical, like she was following some kind of destruction checklist. Snap, snap, snap. Each cut was recorded from multiple angles as she worked her way along the fence line, cutting through wire and posts like she was liberating some kind of prison camp. But she didn't stop there. After destroying about 20 feet of fencing, she pulled out that hammer and started pounding her oversized sign directly into my lawn. The sign read, "No hunting zone. Violators will be prosecuted by HOA," in bright red letters that you could probably see from space. She was claiming my property as HOA territory, which was both illegal and completely insane. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also exactly what I needed. But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets really good. After spending 20 minutes committing felony vandalism on my property, Rebecca pulled out her phone and called 911. "Emergency," she said in this dramatic voice, like she was reporting a terrorist attack or natural disaster. "Eric Johnson is violating the HOA hunting prohibition. I need immediate police response." I watched her through my window, standing on my destroyed property, demanding my arrest for violating rules she'd just made up. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She'd just committed multiple crimes on camera and was now trying to have me arrested for existing on my own land. Amanda called me just before dawn, her voice tense. "I've got something. The HOA has been funneling money into a private account, Rebecca's personal stash." This wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was a full-blown scheme. Officer Martinez arrived about 15 minutes later, and I could see the exhaustion on his face before he even got out of his patrol car. This poor guy was probably regretting every life choice that led him to dealing with neighborhood disputes. He found me sitting calmly on my front porch reading a book and drinking coffee like it was any other Tuesday morning. The contrast between my peaceful demeanor and Rebecca's frantic gesturing was probably striking. Meanwhile, Rebecca was gesticulating wildly at me from my backyard, pointing at her illegal sign like it was some kind of smoking gun that proved my guilt. "Mrs. Gray," Martinez called out, in a voice that suggested he'd reached the end of his patience. "What exactly constitutes the emergency here?" He looked around at the destroyed fence, the unauthorized sign, and me sitting peacefully with my book, and I could see him trying to piece together what had actually happened. "He's violating our hunting ban," Rebecca screamed, pointing at me like I was armed and dangerous. Her voice was reaching that shrill pitch that suggested she was losing whatever grip on reality she'd had left. "That sign proves his violation." Martinez looked from Rebecca to me, to the sign, and back to Rebecca with an expression of complete bewilderment, like he was trying to figure out if he was dealing with someone who'd completely lost their mind. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "he's reading a book. What violation are you reporting exactly?" That's when I stood up and walked over with my characteristic composure. "This situation is a little different today, Martinez," I said calmly. "I have evidence that shows who the real criminal is here." Rebecca's face went white when she heard that. For the first time, I could see genuine fear creeping into her eyes. This was no longer about standing my ground. It was time to go on the offensive. I wasn't just fighting a fine, I was going to expose everything Rebecca had hidden. I invited Martinez inside and fired up my computer to show him the security footage. The video showed everything in perfect detail. Rebecca cutting through my fence, hammering her sign into my lawn, all with timestamps showing it had happened just minutes before her 911 call. Martinez stared at the screen, then looked out the window at Rebecca, who was still standing in my backyard next to her handiwork. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked like professional disappointment. "Ma'am," he said when we went back outside, "I need you to explain this footage to me." Rebecca stormed over and demanded to see what we were talking about. When I played the video back for her, showing her own criminal activity in high definition, I watched her entire reality start to crumble. The look on her face was priceless, like she couldn't believe her own eyes. "That's fabricated," she shrieked, but her voice was shaking now. "He manipulated that video somehow." Martinez looked at her with the patience of a man who'd seen every excuse in the book. The desperation in her voice was becoming more apparent with each word. "Ma'am, this is timestamped security footage from multiple camera angles. This clearly shows you vandalizing Mr. Johnson's property, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. Before we get into vandalism charges, I told Martinez, there's some additional information you need to know. Information that makes this much more serious than a simple property dispute." I asked Martinez if we could speak privately for a moment, and we stepped into my living room while Rebecca watched nervously through the window. What I told Martinez in those next few minutes changed everything. I could see his entire demeanor shift as the implications sank in. As I was about to call Amanda back, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a group of police officers standing on my porch, led by none other than Rebecca. "We have a warrant for your arrest," she said coldly, "for obstruction of justice." This was no longer just a fine, it was war. When we came back outside, Rebecca must have sensed that something fundamental had changed because she was backing toward her car, like she was preparing to run. "Mrs. Gray," Martinez said in a voice that had gone completely official, "I think you need to understand exactly who you've been harassing. I wonder if this is the moment I should reveal the whole truth." Because Rebecca Gray was about to learn that she'd picked a fight with someone who had resources she never could have imagined. Rebecca smiled as if she'd already won, but her confidence faltered when I slowly reached for my wallet. "You've made a big mistake," I said quietly, pulling out my federal badge. Her face drained of color. I walked back into my house and returned with my weathered leather wallet. When I opened it and showed Martinez the federal badge and official identification inside, I felt my entire demeanor shift from peaceful neighbor to federal law enforcement officer. "Martinez," I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I use at work. "I'm Eric Johnson, Federal Wildlife Officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service." My hunting activities on this property aren't just legal recreational activities. They're a part of my official duties monitoring the federal wildlife preserve that borders my land. I watched Martinez's eyes widen as the full implications of what I was telling him sank in. Outside the window, Rebecca was straining to hear our conversation, but she had no idea her world was about to collapse completely. She thought she was dealing with some random neighbor who'd eventually cave to her pressure. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Martinez immediately snapped to attention when he saw my credentials. "Yes, sir, Officer Johnson. I had no idea about your federal status." The respect in his voice was immediate and complete. Meanwhile, through the window, I could see Rebecca trying to eavesdrop on our conversation, probably wondering why Martinez's whole attitude had suddenly changed. When she heard the words, "Federal Wildlife Officer," her confident smile dropped instantly. She took a step back, almost stumbling, her eyes wide in disbelief. You're lying," she stammered, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. I watched her knees buckle, and she crashed into one of my patio chairs, all the color draining from her face like someone had pulled a plug. This wasn't some random neighbor she'd been harassing. This was a federal law enforcement officer, and she'd just committed crimes against federal property. The woman who thought she could intimidate anyone was about to face the full weight of the federal government. "Martinez," I continued laying out the full scope of what had been happening, Mrs. Gray hasn't been harassing some random private citizen. She's been obstructing a federal officer in the performance of his duties, vandalizing property adjacent to federal land, and filing false police reports against a law enforcement officer. These aren't civil matters anymore. These are federal crimes. About that time, my attorney William Parker arrived with a briefcase full of documentation. Additionally, William added spreading out financial records and forged documents. "Mrs. Gray has embezzled over $7,000 from the HOA accounts, forged legal documents, and has a documented history of harassment at multiple previous residences." The mountain of evidence was overwhelming. Rebecca finally understood the magnitude of what she'd done. She hadn't just picked a fight with some neighbor who liked to hunt. She'd been conducting a criminal campaign against a federal officer. The woman who thought she could intimidate anyone was now facing federal prosecution. "This can't be happening," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I'm the HOA president. I enforce community standards." But her protest sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to some semblance of authority that had already evaporated. The desperation in her voice was palpable, and I could see the exact moment when reality hit her. I didn't give her a chance to speak. "You're not in charge here anymore. You've been breaking the law, and now it's time to pay for it." The air between us felt thick with tension, and I could tell Rebecca knew she'd lost. "Ma'am," Martinez said with finality, "you're under arrest for vandalism, harassment, filing false police reports, and obstructing a federal officer in the performance of his duties." The handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists was one of the most satisfying sounds I'd ever heard. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Rebecca. Within 24 hours, her arrest triggered a cascade of consequences that destroyed everything she'd built. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and the few actual residents who served on the board voted unanimously to remove her as president. Federal charges were filed for obstructing a federal officer. The HOA demanded immediate repayment of the $7,000 she'd embezzled. I filed a civil lawsuit seeking $15,000 in damages for harassment and property destruction. A 5-year restraining order was issued to keep her away from my property. Several of her previous harassment victims came forward with additional complaints, and the FBI opened a criminal investigation into her misuse of HOA funds and document forgery. Rebecca's entire world came crashing down in less than a day. But the real justice came from seeing the neighborhood transform after Rebecca's reign of terror ended. Amanda was promoted to interim HOA president and immediately reversed all of Rebecca's illegal policies. Neighbors who had been living in fear started talking openly about the abuse they'd endured. Stories emerged of Rebecca fining families for children's chalk drawings on sidewalks, demanding removal of patriotic decorations because they weren't sophisticated enough for the neighborhood, threatening elderly residents over minor lawn imperfections, and using HOA funds to improve her own property while claiming it was for community benefit. The entire neighborhood had been held hostage by one woman's power trip, and finally they were free. People were smiling again, children were playing in their yards without fear, and the community was healing. A week later, I was back to my normal routine sitting on my porch with fresh orange juice watching the deer graze peacefully in my yard. No clicking cameras, no shouting matches at the fence, no police visits. The neighborhood kids were playing freely in their yards, again families were displaying their decorations without fear, and the elderly residents were tending their gardens in peace. Amanda sent me a text that made me smile. "Thank you for liberating us from her dictatorship. The entire neighborhood is celebrating. We're planning a community barbecue, and you're the guest of honor." I looked toward my security camera setup and addressed it with a knowing smile. Never underestimate the quiet neighbor, folks. Sometimes the most peaceful people are exactly the ones you shouldn't try to intimidate. Rebecca Gray thought she could bully anyone into submission, but she made one critical error. She never bothered to find out who she was actually challenging. I raised my orange juice in a mock toast. Here's to federal justice and Karen's learning about consequences. Sometimes bullies need to learn harsh lessons about real authority. And sometimes those lessons come with federal credentials and the full weight of the United States government behind them. As I sat back watching the sunrise, it hit me just how sweet justice really was. Rebecca Gray, the woman who thought she ruled her little HOA kingdom with an iron fist, had learned the hard way that there's always someone with more power. She thought she was untouchable, I muttered to myself, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. But in the end, she was just a small-time criminal who picked the wrong fight. The mailbox that used to deliver threatening letters now held thank you cards from grateful neighbors. The fence Rebecca destroyed had been rebuilt stronger than before, and the HOA was now operating transparently under Amanda's honest leadership. Rebecca Gray was sitting in federal detention, facing multiple felony charges. Her reign of terror permanently ended. With a final sip of my orange juice, I looked out at the family of deer grazing peacefully in my yard, a quiet reminder that sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes, it's perfect. If you've stuck with me through this wild ride, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a Karen in your life? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that little thanks button to support the channel. Thanks for hanging out with me. Catch you in the next one.
HOA stories where neighbors feud, secrets spill, and karma always clocks in. Stick around, we've got receipts.